powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts. What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological polarization. Power relations and sociocultural impact. A conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March, 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological polarization. Power relations and sociocultural impact. A conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March, 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological polarization. Power relations and sociocultural impact. A conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March, 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological polarization. Power relations and sociocultural impact. A conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. On the 1st and 2nd of March, 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological polarization. Power relations and sociocultural impact. A conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar.
بتكون نهارتها الساعة 5 اشتغلت بس بعد عندي فراغين محل تاني مش عارفة مش معبالة اياهم هشام ممكن احتاجك فيهم.
هل وظفت القوى الدولية شبكات التواصل الاجتماعي في إدارة حروبها وصراعاتها؟ وما دور هذه الشبكات في الاستقطاب الأيديولوجي؟ كيف يمكن استخدامها في تعزيز الديمقراطية وحقوق الإنسان؟ شبكات التواصل الاجتماعي والاستقطاب الأيديولوجي
University. On the 1st and 2nd of March, 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological polarization. Power relations and sociocultural impact. A conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass Communications Department at Qatar University. on the 1st and 2nd of March 2023. Have international powers used social media networks to manage their wars and conflicts? What is the role of these networks in ideological polarization? How can they be used to promote democracy and human rights? Social media networks and ideological polarization. Power relations and sociocultural impact. A conference by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and the Mass
May the peace and blessings of God be upon you. Welcome in this session. We also salute all the viewers that are following the session that is currently being broadcast live on Al Jazeera Mubashir and all the different social media platforms. Welcome. We hope this is an enriching, informative session, and we hope it is an interactive session when we open the Q&A after the presentations from the different speakers who are honoring us with their presence. On the second day of this conference, entitled Social Media Networks and Ideological Polarization, Power Relations and Socio-Cultural Impact, held, as you know, by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and Qatar University. We will resume the discussions in this session 3, entitled Legislations and Ethics of Social Media Networks, Current Problems and Future Aspirations.
خلال هذا الصباح أثارت المحاضرة التي قدمها الأستاذ الدكتور نبيل دجاني
This morning, the presentation of Dr. Nabil Dajani raised some very important issues related to the ethical and legal structure for a just social media public sphere, especially when it comes to the opportunities of intervention by the community to present a constructive model regarding the dealing with these platforms, as well as the logical approach he presented in order to deal with the negative implications of the use of social media. Within this context, we're going to try to delve into the structural problems of the digital sphere that bears the content of social media platforms and its role in the problem we're going to discuss, or the topic we're going to discuss today in the different sessions. It will also identify the main structural disruptions causing social, cultural, and even political damages based or coming from fake news. So we are going to try with our speakers to identify the problems, to expand the means of pondering these issues by presenting a proposal for an ethical design as in the paper of Dr. Hisham Al-Makki, or by uncovering the structural roots of misinformation. In this session, we are joined by Dr. Victor Pickard, Dr. Imad bin Labidi, Dr. Hisham Al-Makki, and Dr. Abdulrahman Al-Shami. I'm not going to be very lengthy. We will immediately start this heavy and full of information session, as I've mentioned.
مرحبا من جديد بالضيوف الكرام. نبدأ مباشرة مع
Welcome once again to our dear viewers. We start with Dr. Victor Pickard, who is going to try to uncover the structural roots of misinformation and the possibility of establishing a new or another media system. We would like to introduce him. He is the C. Edwin Baker professor of media policy and political economy at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication, where he co-directs the Media Inequality and Change Center. Dr. Pickard has authored more than 150 articles, essays, and book chapters in leading scholarly journals and anthologies. His opinion editors and essays frequently appear in popular outlets such as The Guardian, The Washington Post, Columbia Journalism Review, Harvard Business Review, Jacobin, The Progressive, The Nation, and The Atlantic. Dr. Pickard has published 6 books, including the award-winning America's Battle for Media Democracy and Democracy Without Journalism, Confronting the Misinformation Society. You have the floor, Dr. Victor Pickard.
Excellent. All right. Good morning, everyone.
صباح الخير
I want
جميعا.
to start out by thanking the
أود أن
organizers
أبدأ
for
بشكر
inviting me
المنظمين
and
على
giving us
دعوتي
these opportunities
وعلى
to
منحنا
have
هذه
such
الفرص بأن
stimulating and
نجري
timely
هذه الحوارات المحفزة والمحمسة والتي تأتي في وقتها.
will focus on
ورقتي اليوم سوف تركز على بعض الأفكار التي طرحت أمس واليوم هذا الصباح في محاولة لتبيين المشاكل التي نواجهها في مواقع التواصل هنا اليوم، وكذلك رأسمالية الاجتماعية. سوف أحاول أن أتخيل ما يمكن للأنظمة البديلة أن تقدمه، كيف ستبدو، ليس فقط إعادة هيكلة منصات التواصل الاجتماعي، ولكن أيضاً بالتركيز كيف أن الأخبار والمعلومات يتم إنتاجها. لن نتوقف عند هذا الحد في مواقع التواصل، يجب أن نضمن أن يكون هناك توفر مستمر لمعلومات وأخبار متنوعة ضمن منظومة الإعلام. ذكر وينستون
service ideal for our social media platforms. This is definitely something that I want to try to expand on. It's something that's covered in the Westminster Manifesto, and it's also something that is covered in my recent book from 2020, where I'm looking at some of these more ambitious, even dare I say utopian ideas. And in fact, I think our current conjuncture calls for utopian, realistic utopian measures. A lot of my analysis does look at the American situation, but this is not to suggest that the U.S. media system is any sort of exemplar. In fact, quite the contrary. I think we can draw from the U.S. case study cautionary tales of what not to do, namely not to build such a heavily commercialized media system. So I think there are some lessons to learn from our mistakes. Now, I do, as a political economist, I like to start out by looking at questions of ownership and control with a structural analysis, try to understand what is it in our news media ecosystem that encourages misinformation, what are the structural roots of these problems, and I think it's fair to say that it's the core business model, and this was coming up a lot yesterday as well, what we might refer to as surveillance advertising, so that the main logic, the commercial logic that's driving so much of our media is really meant to capture our attention and deliver it to advertisers. This is the core profit imperative that's driving so much of our media that encourages dis and misinformation, but also just low quality information in general, so that content decisions are being dictated by the profit imperatives of media owners and investors, encouraging what might be referred to as a media oligarchy model. So it turns out that building our public sphere upon the commercial imperatives of private profiteers was bad social policy. We should have never done that in the first place, and I think one of our first tasks is to try to figure out how do we create a different kind of system. Now, at the same time, as misinformation is being amplified throughout our media ecosystems, actual high-quality information is being defunded in many countries. Whether we're talking about newspapers or public media, we're seeing the weakening of these institutions that might serve as a countervailing force against the fake news and misinformation that's being amplified. So just very briefly to focus on this commercial journalism crisis, which for various structural reasons happened earlier and in a more profound manner in the US compared to many countries around the world. But you're seeing this similar crisis in commercial systems in countries across the globe. And that in many countries where newspapers are still the last bastion for creating original and reliable news and information, they're the ones that are radically being dismantled as advertisers and readers migrate to the web, where digital advertising pays pennies to the dollar of traditional print advertising. And of course, much of that is going to the platforms, Google and Facebook duopoly in particular. So that's another case where platforms are, although not the root cause of our journalism crisis, are certainly exacerbating it by gobbling up all the digital advertising revenue. So that this advertising revenue model is irreparably broken. It's not coming back. There really isn't a way to monetize reliable news and information online. So we have to start looking to non-market-based means of support. And of course, fewer revenues equals fewer journalists. Newspapers are collapsing or going online only. They're closing, declaring bankruptcy. So we're seeing this systemic market failure that again is really underscoring that commercial sources alone cannot guarantee the journalism that democracy requires. Now, very quickly, I just flashed these graphs to give you a sense of they're all going like this in terms of newspaper circulation, revenues, number of reporters. Just a couple of data points from this. Since the early 2000s, the US has seen around 25% of their newspapers close. Around 70% of their newsroom employees have lost their jobs. Now, this leads to what's increasingly referred to as news deserts, where entire communities and regions across the country lack access to any local news media whatsoever. And into this vacuum is rushing all manner of dis and misinformation, and especially right-wing propaganda, sometimes referred to as pink slime journalism, which is quite evocative of the idea that it's this fake news. So the idea that this news desert idea is a little bit misleading because people are still consuming lots of content. It's just that it tends to be propagandistic and, again, this low quality information in general. So the social costs of losing local journalism, some of this is fairly intuitive, but we now have these natural experiments to see what happens to local communities when they lose access to local news media. They're less informed about politics, less civically engaged, less likely to vote. There are higher levels of corruption and increased polarization. And I know polarization is a theme of our conference, but there's often this misconception that this polarization is leading to crazies on the left, crazies on the right. But really this should be seen as asymmetrical polarization, that it's actually on the right where we're seeing the most extreme forms of political manifestation, fascistic formations, for example, taking root in the US and in many countries around the world. So another problem, I've been talking about the collapse of newspapers and the loss of local journalism, but in the US, unlike most democracies around the world, there really isn't a social safety net for when the market fails to support the level of journalism that we need. And as you can see here, the US is almost literally off the chart for how little we allocate towards our public media system. It comes out to about $1.40 per person per year. If you look at the UK, they're spending about $100 per person per year for the BBC. Nordic countries are spending close to $200 per person per year. And in this particular study, my co-author and I looked at 33 countries around the world to show that there's also positive correlation between having strong public media institutions and strong democracies. Unfortunately, we did not look at Qatar for this study, but I plan on looking at it in my future research. I think Al Jazeera is a very interesting model and an important alternative that deserves more attention. So we're also seeing an accumulation of scholarship that shows that there are all kinds of social benefits that come with maintaining strong public media institutions. It's correlated with higher levels of political knowledge and civic engagement and lower levels of extreme views. The world's strongest democracies, and one of the reasons why I really underscore this point is that especially in the US, as soon as I start talking about how we need to spend more money on our public media, there's a knee-jerk response that this is going to lead to some sort of totalitarian regime. But of course, if we look at the strongest democracies on the planet, and this is according to the Democracy Index that the Economist puts out every year, you see that countries like Norway and Sweden and Finland are not sliding into any sort of totalitarian state by maintaining strong public broadcasting systems, and they also tend to directly subsidize their print media institutions as well. But I think the core difference, and this goes back to Winston's earlier point about having this public service ideal mapped on and reconfigured in our internet and our social media systems as well, that is committed to universal service. So it tries to maintain a baseline level of news and information for all members of society, and to do so in an egalitarian fashion. They don't always live up to those ideals, but those ideals are very much embedded in their DNA, which is often the complete opposite of a commercial system, which often leads to, in a commercial system, leads to various forms of market censorship and redlining, and we can get into that more in the discussion. So some key theses for policy approaches to create this new media ecosystem would include that it's holistic, so that it's multimedia but also multi-layered. We have to look at every stage of distribution, production, and consumption. That it's global, so that it strives to be universal but at the same time sensitive to differences. So not assume that there's one formula that fits all countries and all ethnicities. There has to be a lot of room for participatory democracy to really determine the contours of these systems. And it has to be radical. And what I mean by that, it needs to really push on the discursive parameters that often defines what's possible, especially non-commercial, publicly owned models. I know this is more true in the US, but there's this kind of market fundamentalism that's beyond our imagination to even think about a radically different kind of model that's not just non-commercial, but also determined by publics, by the people who should own and control them. So again, that means that we're not just decommercializing our current media firms and systems, but democratizing them. And I think there are five approaches to doing this. One is to establish public options. That includes not only well-funded public media, but also municipal or public broadband networks to make sure that there isn't a digital divide, to break up or to prevent monopolies and oligopolies from forming in the first place, to regulate news outlets. Now, this is always a tricky one, and we have to be very careful and make sure these are democratic regulations, but at the very least, news organizations should be mandated to be in constant dialogue with the communities that they purportedly serve. Those three are more top-down, and there are two bottom-up, which focus on worker, that is, for example, journalists, owned and controlled media firms, but also community owned and controlled media firms. Now, one of my crazier ideas in my work is to promote this idea of a public media center, which strives to have a multimedia hub in every community that's housed in perhaps already existing public spaces. They could be libraries, post offices, public broadcasting stations, universally guaranteed, but locally owned and controlled by communities themselves. And this is inspired by the independent media center movement in the early 2000s. In fact, there's still one in existence in the middle of the cornfields in Urbana-Champaign that I think approximates this ideal of a publicly owned, publicly governed multimedia hub. They produce a newspaper, a community website, community broadband services, a local radio station. I think that's something that we should be striving for. And then think about creative ways about how this media is elevated within our social media firms, that they are algorithmically advanced. This gets to whether we subscribe to the PMC model or not. There are these 6 layers of democratization that I think we need to focus on. Each one would call for its own particular policy interventions. One is the funding layer. How do we find the resources to fund these new institutions? The governance layer. How will these resource allocations and other key decisions be made democratically? The ascertainment layer. So this again is where the media workers, the media firms are going into the communities to canvass them, to find out what do those communities want to see covered in their local media, to make sure that the communities themselves are making their own media and telling their own stories throughout the entire media ecosystem. The infrastructure layer, which also looks at the platforms, everything from the platforms to the pipes that deliver internet to our homes and to our devices. Again, the algorithmic layer to make sure that public media, reliable media is elevated, that the good stuff is coming up through our news media feeds. And finally, the engagement layer. I think this is a cornerstone to, again, this participatory democratic ideal that communities are in constant dialogue with media institutions. So this does sound fairly radical, but I think our current social media crises are also opportunities to create alternative systems, to democratize our systems, to make sure that our media do not just serve the profit imperatives of people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, but actually are focusing on our democratic needs. And on that optimistic note, I will end. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا للدكتور فيكتور بيكارد.
Thank you so much, Dr. Victor Pickard, for this very thorough and brief research. And of course, as I've mentioned before, we're going to allow for questions after the speakers finish presenting. We now move to Dr. Imad bin Labedi, who is going to focus on narrating the occupation, digital media, Palestinian resistance. He will focus on the false narrative of the occupation. Of course, we will see a manifestation of some of the images or ideas that Dr. Pickard has mentioned. Dr. Imad bin Labedi is an associate professor at the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies, got his PhD from University of Minnesota. He taught before comparative literature, cultural studies, international studies, and comparative media studies, with a focus on American media and cinema in the third world there. His research focuses on political identity and analyzing Western neo-imperial thought through the cultural expression and media representation of Arabs and Islam in the United States. He's published research on different aspects of the political and cultural conflict between the West and the Middle East, and addresses the re-emergence of racist thought in Western media and feature films. I am personally very excited to listen to Dr. Imad Labedi, and I think you feel the same. You have the floor, Doctor.
I want to thank the organizers.
Thank you.
To talk about a completely different topic than Dr. Picard. My paper deals with digital media and resistance. And particularly it talks about Palestinian resistance and the creative ways that Palestinian digital activists are using and mobilizing in terms of trying to impact the existing discourse or create their own counter discourse on so many different levels. I don't have a straightforward narrative. The paper is long and complicated. So what I did is I developed a summary, but I also took the skeleton of it and organized it in a way that I could present it to you in bullet points. And that way you consume it the exact same way you would consume social media. It comes to you in fragments, but hopefully it will cover the most important details. So the summary of the paper narrating the occupation, digital media, and Palestinian resistance examines how the spirit of Palestinian resistance continues to devise creative forms of responding to the brutality of occupation. Despite settler colonial violence and the mobilization of different repressive forces to silence and contain Palestinian voices in general, and activism or online activism in particular, including the taming of several digital platforms, the Zionist colonial political discourse is no longer entirely in charge of narrating the details of its barbaric occupation of Palestine to the world. Palestinians, this paper argues, have creatively transformed their methods of sumud and resistance against military tyranny, oppression, and Israeli institutional racism by TikToking their own experiences and daily daily encounters with the horrors of occupation. More than just educating a misguided global audience about their plight and everyday struggle living under occupation, their use of digital media or digital platforms and the intellectual substance which characterizes the content of their hashtags, images, and narratives show clear indications of a politically engaged community capable of narrating to the world graphic details of colonial brutality, expose the irrepressible greed of a settler mentality for land annexation, and contest truth claims circulated by those who own and control major media institutions. Tweeting, Facebooking, TikToking, depending on which platform allows them to speak before they get blocked, the paper ultimately explains how members of an oppressed and colonized community use digital media to articulate their own subjectivities and defy what Hannah Arendt conceptualizes as different faces of totalitarianism. So this is the overall summary of what the paper is trying to achieve. And now it focuses more on what I call the advantages of social media. It might sound like I'm romanticizing social media, but I'm not. I know it has its limitations, and that's something that could come up in the discussion. But I'm describing these as advantages based on how I saw them impact the existing narrative or the dominant narrative about, the occupation and the conflict and whether it should be called an occupation or a conflict. The paper starts by addressing the creative ways through which Palestinian digital activists are making and unmaking meanings of colonialism, settler colonialism, resistance, liberty, and in the process, exposing the deplorable conditions of those Fanon called the wretched of the earth, or les damnés de la terre, and what they deal with under Israeli tyranny. Here, it is really important to consider how Palestinians are learning to deploy their reports and images and share their perspective on social media platforms and challenge the hegemonic power of conventional media narratives to manage and regulate public understanding of the occupation. And so we're looking at ways that they're really introducing through their participation, in most cases individual participation, they're looking at changing a little bit some of the understandings of colonization, settler colonialism in particular, or at least bring into the public debate, back to the public debate, these different conversations about colonialism and its different forms. And so here, what is really important is to consider how Palestinians are learning to deploy their reports and images and share their perspective on social media platforms and challenge the hegemonic power of conventional media narratives to manage and regulate understanding of the occupation. The saga of an innocent Israel under attack with no other choice but to defend itself, and often does it ruthlessly, is no longer the dominant story. And that has been the dominant story for decades. And Palestinians could barely cause any dent to change that narrative, or at least to change it or contest it. The paper emphasizes what I call a number of advantages on 3 different levels that seem to be performed on digital media: semiotics, logic, and common sense. The first has to do with correcting the language. Occupation is not a conflict. It's an occupation. This correction endeavors to bring to the public debate discussions of different forms of colonization. Again, this is not a conflict, but essentially a settler-colonial relationship of inequality grounded in racial and cultural pathologies that is still in the making. And here, they really, in so many different ways, educate us on looking into the different forms of colonization, on ways where colonial forces walk in to use the native, versus in other instances where settler colonial or settler colonial mentality walks in to replace the native, not to subjugate them or not to use them as labor force, but to completely try and either eliminate them or replace them. The second, unlike Australia, Canada, or the United States, where the native has been completely contained, exterminated, or both, Palestinians are still getting removed and replaced by settlers. Here, the native is not useful to the colonial operation. And here, for the first time, we see Palestinians are able to capture incidents of violations that show how Israeli military apparatus stifles their everyday experience and invades their bodies, spirits, and subjectivities, and forcibly remove them from their own homes. I'm pretty sure many of you saw the video of "I'm stealing your house. If I don't steal it, somebody else will." And in my opinion, that was an incredible confession to see it on YouTube and to have it circulated, where a settler is trying to take over the place of a native, where clearly there is a proof of how the demographics are getting changed in East Jerusalem. The third is the disruption of established dominant representations that limit Palestinian images, as Saeed explained, to either absence or a horrible visibility. The two-dimensional, the conventional two-dimensional essentialized representation of the Palestinian as either a victim or a killer. And so in their attempts to kind of challenge those existing and almost frames that freeze Palestinians in one or the other, Palestinians are clearly creating more room for humanization of Palestinians. The fourth advantage entails a Palestinian taxonomy of what resistance is. Given that all forms of resistance against colonization, including peaceful resistance, have been criminalized, Palestinians needed a new definition of resistance that emerges from the very violations, transgressions, and brutality inflicted on them with hashtags. And if you look up hashtag Palestine, for example, at some point he had, a few months ago, 3.6 billion views. And that definitely has an impact. The fifth advantage is the availability of new possibilities to narrate or report about Palestinian everyday life from the perspectives of those who are conquered and subjugated and work with no media institutions, infrastructure, or global support. There are no Avicii, Adre, or the kind of logistical and financial support that he has access to impact. This is a guy who talks to Arabs in Arabic. He talks to Palestinians in the Palestinian dialect and try to kind of like impact public opinion. The sixth advantage is the unprecedented ability to control the temporality of delivering and disseminating information that used to be dictated by Israel. Of course, a temporality that comes with limitations because at any time an account can be blocked, content deleted, but nevertheless, the information has penetrated through checkpoints and roadblocks, and even though it gets suspended, it may not disappear completely. The seventh advantage offers a new level of education about the ruthlessness of settler colonialism and what the task, the incredible task of challenging this settler mentality that might clearly, when we look at the case of Palestinians in particular, they're really trying to reach an audience that is also a settler colonial audience. And so they're really motivating them in terms of rethinking not only the situation of Palestine, but also their own positioning vis-a-vis their own natives. How am I doing on time? I lost track. The last point is the fact that bringing together with this digital endeavor, the Palestinian activists are bringing together a transnational Palestinian diaspora of activists who could be TikToking from Australia, Canada, or Gaza. This kind of connection, or rather connectivity, was not available before, where you have all these spread out communities in different places, able to communicate together, but also able to share information. In some cases, it gets interrupted. In some cases, it gets passed. And clearly, there's a learning that happens back and forth. And there's this consistent effort to try and create what is called a new public, so to speak, or new publics. People who can rethink the existing conditions of Palestinian occupation. That's all I got. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا للدكتور عماد بن العبيدي على هذه.
Thank you, Dr. Imad bin al-Abidi, for this paper. As you noticed, this fake narrative moved from the press, from classic pieces of media articles, movies, and other debates. In any case related or event related to Palestine, we see how there is a restriction of daily or regular users from Palestine whenever they express their opinion of the Palestinian cause, whether they are Palestinians but also regular users from other nationalities. Currently, Meta, which is the mother company of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, among others. And specifically about Facebook, the next speaker, Mr. Hisham Al-Makki, will be addressing under the title of
the ethics of social media networks, from the ethics of content to ethical design, Facebook as a model. Mr. Hisham Al-Mekki is an associate professor of media and communications at Sidi Mohammed bin Abdullah University in Fes, Morocco. He is also a professor in 2 private Arabic academies. He is the founding director of the chair of the Arab League Educational, Cultural and Scientific Organization, ALISC. Dr. Al-Mekki has served as the managing editor of NAMA, a peer-reviewed periodical for revelation sciences and humanities. He supervised numerous research projects. He also prepares and presents a television program. He has authored 17 publications about media communications and development, both individually and collectively. 13 peer-reviewed studies in the same field have been published, and over 40 studies and articles. You have the floor, Mr. Hisham. Peace and blessings to you all. I would like to start by thanking the organizers and the audience in this conference. As you could see, and as it was presented by the moderator, my paper is on the ethics of social media networks, a topic that I would like you to reflect on. I will start by talking about issues that might be separate to you. However, throughout my presentation, you will see the correlation between ethics of content and ethics of design. When we put a group of children in a room together alone, and we place a platter of candies and tell them that these candies are not healthy for them, and we cannot later on blame them for eating it. So there were cases where we felt guilty because we surfed social media and platforms longer than the time we initially had set for ourselves. Sometimes we stay longer on these pages. Another thing is that I noticed when getting to Doha Airport that there were escalators in some parts of the airport, and then there are the regular stairs, and sometimes you would feel that sometimes it's better to take the regular stairs than the escalators, because at some point you might feel dizzy on the escalator if you're taking it for the first time. So the same applies to my paper in a way, where we talk about the ethics of professional media on social media. This is dedicated to journalists. Ethics of personal use of social media networks, which are the the ethics of personal use of social media by journalists, and the ethics in relation to the use of regular people of social media platforms, and the ethics that are set by the platforms themselves to their users. Generally put, these ethics are important. Their direction is that they would like to keep professionalism and reputation within these platforms, but people do not make the difference between personal presence of journalists on social media and when they represent the institutions they work with. and then I will address the ethics set by BBC and Al Jazeera channels. When we ask people about the ethics of using these platforms, they say that they look at these ethics as observing respect to one another and allowing equal opportunities in using these platforms. And we see that other people consider that these ethics are in place in order to remove damaging or destructive content. But can we see that, or can we say that these ethics are enough to regulate the use of social media platforms? I will be giving Facebook as a model here. Speakers yesterday and today talked about the different violations by Facebook, and since 2016 there were many scandals that show that Facebook was violating ethics whenever they wished to, for different reasons. This takes us to a direct conclusion, which is that the ethics of Facebook are not practically implemented except when they are observed by users, and the guarantor of the implementation of these ethics is only guaranteed when the platform itself observes its ethics. So what we see, or the ethics of Facebook is a commercial use of the ethics themselves rather than anything else. And in these ethics and standards or moral standards that are set, they do not respond to the ethics as they are meant, or as they are meant. This leads to a dilemma. For instance, when it comes to identity, we see that Facebook supports the representation of different identities and also tries to despise any fake identity used. A person can express explicitly their identity on Facebook and on social media that might not be expressed equally in real life. This could lead to the following. Is this a clear attempt to express identity? Does it lead individuals to take specific measures to respond to what they hope for by having such a digital identity, or does it motivate them to have an expression of their identity within their society? We know that social media platforms try to link us to people who are similar to us, and therefore this could lead us to talk about certain isolation of groups or categories. There is also the issue of privacy. We see usually that the terms for privacy are written in very small characters that are very difficult to read, and they are very thorough and long that people do not read them. Are we really qualified to understand well this policy for privacy? And we know that we have to use some applications, but these applications are depicted in a way that doesn't allow us to refrain from using the conventional or the well-known and popular applications and choose those that protect our privacy more. And we know as well that we need to reflect on social media ethics in a new perspective. These ethics are ethics of content, and they rely on aware users. However, there are people of high education and of poor education using social media. There are some people who are aware of the use of social media and how to use them. So there are some rules that would be posted in order to further advise them on how best to use social media, what to say, what not to say, but not everyone can do so. Also, regarding the long use of social media. So we're talking here about an issue of disparity, which is the use by experts of social media and the use of regular people of social media. We know that there are a continuous feed of posts and information, and that sometimes you can press a button in order to read about a topic and then go back as well. However, in Facebook, sometimes you do not, or you cannot go back to a post that you have read, and this is done on purpose as part of its design. And sometimes it is not possible to have a specific common sense in navigating certain content, and this is part of the Facebook algorithm. And if we take the human nature, we cannot be considered rational every time. So we are sometimes rational, sometimes irrational. And in the use of social media, we talk about ethics that consider or that takes it as a granted that we are rational people. We go back to the initial example, which is the platter of candies in a room filled of kids. So sometimes we do not allow them to make rational decisions here, especially if through social media platform, the design is made for us not to be able to take such rational decisions.
So we have to distinguish between two means of using social media platforms. ICT tools bear content, but every way of using it leads a certain social use. So the value of social solidarity is essential in the Arab and humanitarian and Islamic world. We stand in solidarity with those in need, the vulnerable, the widows, the orphans. Another ethical value is charity. So when we benefit from the big technical capabilities in order to gather or raise funds for people in need, the most vulnerable. So you find that the person in need doesn't get the legitimacy of obtaining this charity unless it became a sort of a viral post on social media. So the issue of respecting the dignity of people in need and most vulnerable is something that we learned from our forefathers. So whenever there is such a campaign, you can you can send a sad emoji, you can share it in order to help raise more funds. And if you are convinced, you may help send financial support. We all see media saturated when there's a lot of such humanitarian content on social media. At the same time, I think that nobody can ignore any of their relatives in reality, their colleague at work whom they meet daily whenever they feel they are in desperate need. Civil society organizations whom we commend for their efforts to prove their credibility go through another scandal like post. So every time we use social media, we'd be learning new values, new social values. What can we suggest?
مهما اجتهدنا في الأخلاقيات ما لم
No matter how hard we work on ethics,
وينبغي أن نصمم
we have to design the architecture of Facebook in a way that supports our ethical choices and options. And this is what I present to you. What you see before you on the left speaks about the different options. It helps people take the proper choices without interfering into their freedom to take such decisions. So an ethical design of social media platforms leaves a free choice for people, and it facilitates for them taking decisions in an ethical way at the same time. There are examples that I present to you amongst the main principles to show motivation. So, if the motivations come from our choices, we get a better capability to take better decisions. For example, imagine there are mobile phones that show the cost of international calls. It makes you want to be even more brief in your call in line with your financial capabilities. How to use this principle in the ethical design of Facebook. I said that the Facebook design is non-ethical because it makes us become addicted to social media. So the suggestion for the ethical design
بالدقائق يظهر بشكل بارز على الشاشة كل 10 دقائق ثم يختفي بعد 3 ثواني يذكرك بالزمن الذي قضيته ويترك لك حرية الاستمرار في التصفح. أيضا يمكن أن ندرج خاصية أخرى هي اختيار زمن التصفح في كل مرة نفتح فيها فيسبوك. هذه مفيدة.
So every time we open Facebook
الأول تصفح سريع من البداية ويعطيك زمن
and we start surfing through this, it gives you 3 to 10 minutes, let's say. Moderate surfing, or let's say you choose that timing at the beginning of your opening of Facebook, and it would close it down automatically after that time is done. Now, understanding the match, let's say. The match is individuals' capability to expect the welfare level that this choice is going to present to them. When you go for ice cream, let's say, you expect a certain taste, a certain flavor. Let's say somebody got cancer and they were given a choice, chemotherapy or undergo a radiotherapy, let's say, or not do anything. That's a difficult choice here. So managing privacy goes through the approval notifications. However, in reality, this doesn't allow you to ensure a matching and understand the implications. To help with that, the privacy notifications should come in a more clear manner for all people. Let's say if you approve of our privacy policy, this will allow us to sell your information to the advertisers who may send you messages that you don't want to see, or may want to make you buy things that you don't want to buy. Or if you share your location, everyone can see where you are. You may be subjected to thieves robbing your house. Your boss may know that you're not home even though you took a sick leave. So that's how we can use this principle in the Facebook ethical redesign. So, the parallel track. People usually go for options that require less effort and preserve the default functions.
مثلا إذا قمت بتأمين
For example, if you ensure you get life insurance or a travel insurance at the bank and you travel,
وأنت من عليك القيام
the bank
بالاتصال
renews that insurance every month automatically, and it's up to you to opt out of it.
إذا هناك مجموعة حينما يشترك شخص لأول مرة في الفيسبوك
When a person joins Facebook for the first time, there are some default
مثل خيار المشاركة للعموم
permissions, for example, public sharing,
فقاعات المحادثة
automatic suggestions,
توصل الإشعارات وغيرها من الإعدادات
notifications, etc.,
تصب جميعها في مصلحة الفيسبوك والمتمثلة في
which are all in line with Facebook's interests. So the ethical redesign is to make these options protective away from commercial interests. The user may put in efforts and choose entertainment or commercial approvals.
التي تطلب منه الإذن لتفعيل هذه الأشياء التي ذكرتها في السابق. في وقت أعرض نموذجين آخرين
Is there time so I present two more examples?
طيب أختم هناك أمثلة.
To close, there are other examples.
مثال أخير لأنه يرتبط بفكرة السلام.
Another example related to
بمعنى
margin of error. Most people commit errors or mistakes. So the social media platforms, when being designed, we have to expect that people are going to make mistakes. And this is used on the stairs of Doha Airport. When you're not focused, it stops. Or if you fall or something falls, it automatically stops. How can we use that in the Facebook design? We can make the functions protective, as I mentioned, but also the user may or Facebook has to present, let's say, every 2 weeks a reminder of those options. Maybe the user wants to update their options. As such, we would help people truly improve their use of Facebook. What I've mentioned is also controversial. First, the paternal aspect of this ethical design. There could be some personal or individual options that I may not deem ethical. So, should I adopt them and allow people to adopt them or not? When does the notification is no longer a notification and becomes intervention, interference? For example, choosing not to present to the users, Facebook users, any fast food. This also infringes on their rights. What we're talking about is facilitating the mission before people to make ethical choices, not imposing them on them. We want to be able to push social media platforms to adopt these designs. Many things that we are enjoying today have been or are the fruit of a long journey and a long struggle. That's first. Second, why not invest? Why not have capable institutions invest in the design of social media platforms that are fun and entertaining, but that are ethically designed to allow their use for both us and our children, especially? That awareness has been raised among a lot of people that we are victims of unethical commercial use of social media as we are today. Thank you.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Hisham. It was clear he had a lot of information and a lot of points to raise. If only we had more time, we would have given him more room for discussion. I noted a number of points he raised, mainly the example about experts versus common people, and saying that this equation is not balanced, which leads to addiction and accepting misleading information. This point specifically needs us to confront those social media platforms, to stand up to them. And this is what Dr. Abdulrahman Al-Shami is going to present, who is going to focus on the role of Arab platforms for news verification and fighting disinformation through an analytical study. He is a professor of broadcast and digital journalism at Qatar University's Department of Mass Communications. He was the dean of the Faculty of Mass Communication at Sana'a University. He is a member of many Arab international scientific organizations, participated in various programs, including Fulbright program at Boston University and the study of the U.S. Institute for Scholars, SUSIS, at Ohio University. His research focuses on new media and social change, as well as on digital storytelling. He has published over 30 papers in refereed journals. You have the floor, Dr. Abdulrahman Al-Shami. ما بقى في حدا؟
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بداية
On you.
الشكر موصول لمركز الدراسة مركز الجزيرة للدراسات لمشاركته الفاعلة مع قسمنا قسم الإعلام.
So we thank Al Jazeera Center for Studies for participating with Qatar University and our department to host this conference on very important topic, social media and ideological polarization, which is on the rise. We see that this ideological polarization is on the rise, so we have to ask ourselves, how can we deal with it? This is what I will focus on by highlighting the role of Arabic platforms, which is a very or a relatively recent practice. These topics that I will focus on, fighting disinformation and the findings that I found. The concept of fake news or misinformation goes beyond untrue or false information. It goes further than this and includes different types of fake news, such as satire, parody, fabrication, manipulation, and propaganda. So there are 6 types of such fake news, as we've mentioned. Satire, parody, falsification, fabrication, manipulation, and of course, propaganda.
الواقع أن ظاهرة الأخبار الزائفة أو الكاذبة
In
الكاملة
reality,
هي
the
حقيقة
phenomenon of
واقعة.
fake news is a
بل
reality
وشائعة الانتشار. هذه إحدى
that
المنصات
is
التي
widespread. This is
الرأسية
one of
المكرسة
the
لبحث
platforms
الأخبار
that is
الزائفة
used for
واسمها
identifying those fake news.
تونسيا
It's
تشيك
called
نيوز. درست
Tunisia
في حوالي
Check
شهر
News.
وبضعة أيام الأخبار
In
فوجدت
1
لا
month and
من
7 days, it
15
identified
خبراً إلى
15
20
to
خبراً في اليوم
20
هي أخبار
news
زائفة.
a day
من مجموع
as fake news. Out of
236
236,
تبين أن 90%
apparently,
من هذه الأخبار
news that
هي
is published
أخبار
news,
زائفة.
apparently
لفترة
90%
من
of
9
those
أبريل
are
إلى
fake.
من 2 مارس إلى 9
So
أبريل بمعنى
3
شهر
March to
وعدة
9
أيام.
April,
هذا
or 2 March to
يعكس
9
مدى
April.
المنحنى الصاعد وكم الأخبار المتداولة من هذه الأخبار
So this
الزائفة
goes to show the
والتي
ascending
تكلفتها اجتماعية
trend in
وسياسية واقتصادية على وجه
fake
التحديد
news, knowing
تتجاوز
that
على مستوى العالم
they
78
have an
مليار
economic
سنوياً.
cost of
ومن هذا
78 billions
المنطلق
a day.
أحاول أن أقارب هذا الموضوع وأتقصى
So,
دور
from this
وجهود
perspective, I try to
منصات التحقق العربية فيما
identify the efforts made
يتعلق
by
بصحة الأخبار الزائفة أو
Arab
الكاذبة والمعلومات
fact-checking platforms
ومدى قدرة
and
هذه
their
المنصات
effectiveness
أو مدى قدرة
in
هذه المنصات على مواجهة هذا السيل
mitigating
الأخبار
this
الزائفة.
flow of fake news.
مجموعة من الأهداف وضعت لهذه الدراسة تحاول
This study has a number of
تبرز أبرز
objectives,
هذه المنصات ومدى انتظامها في متابعة الأخبار
and it
الزائفة
showcases
وما
the
السياسة
effectiveness
التحريرية
of
التي
those
تستند
fact-checking
إليها في
platforms
ممارسة عملها
in
ومنهجيتها
identifying
في
fake
التحقق
news, their
من صحة
methodology,
ودقة المعلومات والأخبار بالإضافة
what
إلى رصد
approach
أهم
they
الموضوعات
adopt.
خلال فترة الدراسة وما
The study
أبرز
also
الوسائط
identifies
التي
the main
تستخدمها
topics raised
وأخيراً
during
منح
its
البلد
the
التي
review
ركزت
period
عليها
and
هذه الأخبار الكاذبة
the countries that those fake
والمعلومات
news
المضللة
were
أثناء
centered
فترة
on.
الدراسة. اخترت 3 منصات من الصعب
I
على
chose
باحث
3
بمفرده
platforms
أن يدرس كل هذه المنصات
because it's
ومن
very
ثم
difficult to
توزيع الجغرافية إلى
examine
حد
them
ما
all
يعكس
by
3
one person.
منصات إخبارية هي هيئة مكافحة الإشاعات
We have the
وفتبين
anti-rumor
وإصبار.
authority,
حللت العينة
Fatabenua
خلال
and
شهر
Misbar,
نوفمبر وديسمبر من
and I
العام
analyzed that in
2022
November, December
ومن ثم
2022,
وجدت أن عدد
and
المواد
I found
الصحفية
that
التي
the
نشرت وتم التحقق
quantity
منها من
of
خلال هذه
content
المنصات
of news
646
published and verified by those
تنوعت ما بين مقاطع فيديوهات
was
قصيرة
646,
وصور
including
صحفية
videos,
وتقارير وتغريدات.
pictures,
هذه
tweets, posts,
المنصات
and
التي
news
استطعت أن
articles.
أحصيها على المستوى العربي لدينا
These are the
23
Arabic
منصة.
fact-checking
الأردن 6 منصات،
platforms, 6
تونس
in
4
Jordan,
منصات
4 in
وبس، ثم
Tunisia,
الجزائر
and 4 in
منصتان
Egypt, 2 in
وبقية الدول
Algeria, and the
العربية
other countries, Saudi Arabia,
العراق
Iraq, Libya, Yemen,
لكل منها
Palestine
منصات.
have only one.
هذه نوع من المنصات ونلاحظ عملية التبويب الذي يختلف من منصة إلى
So we see the classification from one platform to another. Mostly it's political news that is amongst the most published fake news. 226. And the classification differs from one platform to another. This is the Falso platform. It focuses on identifying hate speech and fake news. And we see how rich those platforms are in terms of their the variety of the topics. Some have a digital meter for the number of those news. Others use a quiz that the user has to go through and has to answer those questions before they so that the platform can identify how knowledgeable and aware they are of fake news, and can they really identify a piece of fake news from a piece of real news.
تفاوت في عرض المعلومات، والبعض منها قد يكون له منصة على الفيسبوك فقط، والآخر قد يكون محور تركيزه على نحو خاص فيما يتعلق
Some
بالإشاعات
platforms
فقط.
focus on
المحور الثاني
or
ما هي
fact-checking
المواد
platforms
التي
focus on
أثناء
specific
فترة
social
الدراسة
media means more than others. What is the content that was analyzed? First, we find that Misbar platform is very active.
نوفمبر وديسمبر نشرت
And the material produced in November and December and that I've analyzed is close to 74%. Natabayanu is another platform and the anti-rumor platform that only focuses on rumors. The topics. Mostly it was sports events. Usually it's political news. But during November and December 2022, it was mostly sports news, of course. It's well known. Why? Because World Cup and being held in Qatar. We're talking about 267 news followed by political news to have around 92 piece of news, and then you have religious and other news in the last category. Now for the countries. It was very natural to have Qatar as the center of that fake news and false information due to the fact that it was hosting the 2022 World Cup. It reached 155 news. So what is the conclusion we can come up with from such a study? Of course, times of crisis and disasters are the best environment for fake news and false information. But when you're having a state level global event, we have an indicator that this is an opportunity used by active stakeholders, whether on purpose or not, and a good intention or not. So if you have an important mega event at the state level or at the specific sectoral level, this is an ample opportunity for fake news producers. Egypt was ranked second since it was the anniversary of the Arab Spring. And in other countries, there was talk about the fact that 11 November will be the start of big Arab protest movements. Videos are the most used means of publishing false information. Why? Because visuals are more attractive. Those who are producing fake news, whether on purpose or not, are greatly interested in videos, focused on videos, and then followed by photos, pictures, then written news, and then tweets. The Facebook comes first. The news that I have analyzed, you have 148% or 72% published on Facebook. The rest, 21%, is through other social media platforms. So Facebook is the pioneering platform when it comes to hosting fake news and false information. Because we are in the Levant, of course, we know that Facebook is widely spread along with Twitter. But in other countries, Facebook is the favorite for such false information. I conclude the following. These platforms should be adding more value to proper journalists' work by revealing fake news, misinformation, or at least, as we see before us, the news and media outlets should understand that there are people who are refusing their work, and so they have to go through these platforms.
كما ذكرت الأخبار
As I
الزائفة
had mentioned,
والمعلومات
false
المضللة
information,
مرتبطة بأحداث
disinformation,
الأزمة.
fake
لنلاحظ
news
مثلاً
are
في
related to
2020
big
وفقاً
events
لمسبار
and disasters. In 2021,
تزايدت أو ارتفعت
according to
وتيرة
Misbar platform,
الأخبار الزائفة بمقدار
the
3
frequency
أضعاف.
of fake news increased
يعني بعض الأحيان
threefold.
نستغرب يعني من يقومون على صناعة الأخبار نلاحظ
Those
عملية
producing fake news
في صناعة هذه الأخبار الزائفة من حيث استخدام البرامج التي تساعد على التضليل، بمعنى لديهم مهارات في استخدام الفوتوشوب وغيره. حتى وصلت الاستخدام السياسي في ظل الزلزال الذي حدث في تركيا أن أصبحت مثلا تركيا في
So,
الوقت الحالي هي
after
موضع
the
للأخبار
earthquake in Turkey, for
الزائفة.
example,
ننتقل
Turkey
لنقطة
became
أخرى.
a
الواقع أن
center
الداخل غالبا
or a central
هو
topic in those
المسؤول
fake
عن
news.
تداول ونشر الأخبار. وفقا للمرصد الأردني
According to the Jordanian Observatory, in November, 24 rumors were spread. 100% came from the inside of Jordan, and in December, 90% came from the inside. So, for every country, the activists should focus on what is being published on the inside. So, the inside has the means, the tool to fight that information.
يمكن الأغراض ليست على مستوى الأحزاب فقط، ربما تكون على مستوى اهتمامات الأشخاص. لاحظوا هذه الصورة. من الواضح أن من قام على هذه الصورة هو
Look at this picture. Those who spread this picture may have a political motive to support the leftist candidate. And the picture tells you this is not a garden, this is at the occasion of the leftist president coming to power. So for ideological reasons, so you may have fake news spread by certain political movements or parties. So they may use a picture from a previous event to speak about a current event. For example, this long line of people or a long line of books, while the caption pretended that this is a book, a free book exhibition, etc. So this information may come for commercial purposes. For example, when you speak about Uber and say that this is used by the government to surveil people, you are using fake news. Sometimes the purpose is religious. The World Cup in Qatar was a big opportunity to spread fake news, maybe based on good intention. We don't know, but some may have some certain purposes.
Last but not least, videos are the preferable material used to create fake news, and Facebook is the main platform for that purpose. The question that begs itself, to what extent can we have or stop using these platforms? These are important platforms and they have been able to ensure a certain popularity. People go to these platforms to find or maybe try to find responses or guidance to see whether a piece of news is fake or correct. These platforms cannot follow up on all the news. However, they rely on trafficked news that are being circulated the most. These are or the attempts done by these platforms are appreciated irrespective of who is behind them. Well, however, what is the initiative that we as academics could do, since, as I mentioned, fake news is a reality. Since the inception of press, we know that there is what we call yellow press that used to spread fake news. So we would only expect increasing spread of fake news. So this is a reality that is expected inevitably. And so the question is, what can we do in this case to combat fake news? Definitely verifying the news and fact-checking is the essence of professional press and media work. However, we need to see to what extent we can work together in order to raise awareness on fake news. And I believe that educational curriculums should also have or encompass raising awareness on media because I believe that we cannot combat fake news except by introducing this topic as a subject matter in educational systems. Combating misleading information and fake news is also important to raise critical thinking. Since it's the critical mindset at an individual level that would be the most effective way to combat fake news. I would conclude to say that curricula at the primary, complementary, secondary levels, or complementary and secondary levels and at university levels is very important to combat fake news. So we're talking about media awareness. This is something that we've been, or some people have been calling for. Now we're talking about digital media literacy, and today I tell you we need social media literacy. So decades have elapsed while we were calling for media to be introduced in education. We need to have such a syllabus as a part of education and as a requirement for all students, not only for journalists or media students, journalism or media students at a university level. So we need to this type of literacy in order for us to be able to combat this growing phenomenon that is fake news. With that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Dr. Abdelrahman Shami. He talked about initiatives to combat fake news and misinformation. We at Al Jazeera took the initiative to create Sanad, which is a means for us to combat misinformation and fake news. It provides some training sessions to journalists and media experts, to professionals rather, to learn more about combating fake news, misinformation, and the like. So, as I said, this platform, Sanad, by Al Jazeera, was created for this purpose. Dr. Shami talked about misleading by governments. We know that there's the scandal Analytica that manipulated voters in the US, in addition to an Israeli platform dedicated to the world that spreads fake news, and that has both some journalists and that turned out to be involved in rigging or in manipulating elections in a number of countries that are known for their democracy and so forth. We would like to thank the speakers for their valuable papers. I would like to open the floor to the audience to raise their questions. I hope your questions are concise. Limit yourself to one question and to whom you are dedicating this question. And if you could also introduce yourselves, whether you are students, academics, and the entity you start with. Let's start here. My question is to Dr. Abdelrahman. A very valuable presentation. My question to Dr. Abdelrahman, we followed the World Cup and read what was spread in Western media, which is that fake news created in labs and that are spread through media outlets. We have seen how the Arab media and specifically sports media in Doha have countered these or this fake news. Regarding fake news, we cannot combat them when they are created in Western and Arab labs. What we could do is to have counter news, and we have seen the dimensions that media in the UK and France. Also regarding education or media curriculum in education, I have another question. No. Let's limit your interventions to one question. There are a large number of people who wish to ask questions, so let's maximize the little time allocated to this session. So let's take a round of questions and then we answer the question. No, let's answer this question first. Media literacy helps regular students from the initial stages to uncovering fake news. When a common or a regular person receive a video or a tweet, an educated person, media educated person that is, could tell whether it is fake or not. However, the regular people who don't have or barely have a minimum education will not be able to uncover fake news. When news are made professionally, then we can expect good and correct news. However, the problematic lies in the circulation of news by educated people with a degree, and that they start spreading fake news. So this media literacy would provide people the possibility at least to ask questions on whether or not a material published is fake or not, and then they would start thinking whether it is worthy of being published. Take the issue of Finland. They started working since 2016 on news. They provided training on to combat fake news, and then they helped shape the mindset of their students in order to be able to identify fake news. Another question.
Thank you very much. Nigel is my name, from Zimbabwe. Very quickly to Victor. Thanks in fact, to all the panelists for the submissions. I just wanted to find out from your ideas around the alternative media system, if you have explored, particularly around funding, how we can then safeguard that funding of the alternative media system is not captured by the state. In other words, to then replace the current form of capitalism, which really is within a few conglomerates, individuals, into replacing it with state capitalism. Then very quickly to Dr. Iman on leadership in the resistance. Who were the leaders? And were they identifiable, or they were using pseudo accounts and so forth?
تفضل دكتور فيكتور. نعم.
Thank you. It's a great question. It always comes up, a very important question that we need to be sure that corporate capitalism isn't simply replaced by state capitalism. And anytime we're talking about subsidizing a public media system, it has to be public not only in name, but actually owned and controlled by the public. There are various ways to set this up, but the fund that supports the system must be entirely independent from the state. And that can be done, and countries have done this to varying degrees of success. But I think while the state has an obligation to make sure that this funding structure is there, it should always be arm's length. There should be ironclad safeguards and firewalls between state and control of the money. The allocation of the money should be made by local communities or various representative bodies. The UN could be involved in this when we're talking about internationally allocating resources, but we have to make sure it's not captured by the state.
قبل أن أتوجه من جديد للجمهور فقط لحظة، لدي بعض الأسئلة. تفضل دكتور باختصار من فضلك. طيب فقط هي بعض الأسئلة من الطالبات الحاضرات معنا والتي تصب.
Questions from the students present here. They raised a number of questions. Tana Mohammadi has a question to Dr. Ahmad Al-Abidi, saying how can we overcome the issue of suspending Palestinian accounts. Najla, another student, said how can media outlets destroy one society, for instance, such as the example of Palestinian community, and what can be done to overcome that. Another student asks what are the solutions that we could come up with in order to combat misinformation in relation to Palestinians. The dominant discourse has provided a specific description or representation of Palestinians that is difficult to combat by Palestinians themselves using conventional media. This media or conventional media doesn't have the capabilities to combat this depiction of Palestinians and the stereotyped depiction of Palestinians. There is this picture of Palestinians that is described, which is that Palestinians are only violent people, and the consumers of this representation, and this is what I meant when I talked about common sense in my paper, which is knowing the visceral knowledge of people. The visceral knowledge is a fake representation. So those people think that they know a certain person accurately, and at the same time there is a contradiction here, because this is not stemming from the knowledge and of those people, but rather from the use of stereotypes that are being reproduced on various platforms. What digital media activists did is that they challenged these pictures by communicating directly with the follower. And Palestinians themselves are contributing to redefining themselves among people or the public. When the world sees correct representation and pictures depicting Palestinians, then this would lead to combating this stereotype picture of Palestinians depicted in books, in movies, and so forth, which is considered as a mass production. Palestinians are capable to redefine or represent themselves again in a way or from their own perspective. Thank you, Mr. Ahmad. Another question from the audience.
I have a comment that I would like to address to Professor Becker in the hope that he will respond to it. I enjoyed the 4 presentations, but these presentations sort of make me conclude or at least observe 2 approaches to journalistic information. A Western approach represented by Professor Becker and a non-Western approach by the other 3 speakers, particularly the presentation by Professor Mekki about extensive presentation about the Facebook. Now, the problem I see with Western presentation or discussion of journalistic training is their basically quantitative approach to journalism, while in the other approach we see a qualitative approach. In the West, Western scholars, Western journalistic scholars talk about number of journalists, technological facilities, and so on, but they really ignore or not give enough attention to the implication of news, while in the non-Western approach, the focus is on the implication of news. And this is where we see really a problem in the world today. In the West, which is dominant in the dissemination of news, we lack, or at least the Western public lacks the interpretation of news. So they're given superficial information about the implication of information that they release. There's no cultural background to the information they provide. So as a result, the Western public lacks the proper democratic participation in guiding their governments towards foreign policies in the non-Western world. So I would like to have your comment on this.
Excellent observation. It's a little bit ironic because I'm a qualitative researcher, not a quantitative researcher, but I understand what you're saying in terms of how, what some of the weaknesses are in the Western press. It's certainly a decontextualization, although I wouldn't overgeneralize problems in the U.S. media system to the entire Western world. I think we have some unique problems that we grapple with, but I think your observation's spot on. There's no question that our media, and again, I wouldn't say it's only because of the commercial values, but I would say it's largely because of the commercial values that are driving it, that it tends to be decontextualized. It does not go into the history and the political economic relationships, especially around international news. So Americans, if they actually knew what their government was doing, I think would be much more upset about many of the things that the rest of the world is painfully aware of with the U.S., and not just during wartime, but just our finances as well, and what we're supporting around the world. So I think you're absolutely right. And to be continued. I'd like to talk to you more about this later.
بالتأكيد نحن في جامعة قطر، وهذا مكان الطلبة، مكانهم الأصلي والجوهري مثل ما تعرفون. نتمنى لكل الطلبة إن شاء الله مستقبل زاهر.
Wish a bright future to all students. Munira Ali Al-Merri, student here, is asking a question about an important platform that was not touched upon in this session, which is TikTok. We see that TikTok has become the fastest media to shape the concept or the mindset of young people, and it is a soft tool. And the US Congress has requested the ban of Twitter because they are aware of its negative effect. How can we use TikTok for the benefit of the Arab and Islamic world? And the question is to Mr. Mekki. TikTok is one of the capabilities that is also available on Facebook through the share of Reels. So now we're talking about a technology that is related to the to mass public. There is this dissociation between the user and the medium that is used. So we're talking about the positive and the negative aspects of the use. This is true and inaccurate, though, at the same time. The nature of these platforms require us to talk in a specific language or to use specific terms. Most of the content or the videos on TikTok are spread through videos that can easily be published. We cannot, or not all issues are or could be highlighted by using TikTok. The more we talk about social media, it's difficult to look at them from the commercial perspective because they are very social in how they deal with the people. So when we start looking at them from a commercial perspective, then we can start talking about them in a way that would allow to see whether their services are being used to spread culture and so forth. Definitely, we could use TikTok and other platforms to raise awareness, sensitize people, and so forth. However, whenever we would use a medium for the service of a question, then there is a change in the structure of using these platforms. So not all the measure or not all the we cannot use all these platforms for or to advance these ideas. We need to always think about the commercial aspect of them. My question is to the researcher who talked about critical thinking, specifically when it comes to media literacy. However, maybe after critical thinking becomes a skill, we would have a group of people that would emerge and that would question the veracity of a specific news. So how can we shape this critical thinking but keep it within the limits? This is a very important question. The commercial use, and say for instance on a platform there is a specific store that could promote certain ads, and they would say if the 15 people watch this ad, you would have this product delivered at your door and without charges. So I commented saying that no, this is not true. And they liked my, and so the company itself or the store itself liked my comment and did not delete it. So this is what we would see. The admin could remove my comment, but I was surprised to see that they clicked like on my comment, and this is what leads us to say that those platforms rely on circulation, and part of misinformation or disinformation is an attempt to confuse people, and therefore the pattern or the material that would be used to uncover the fakeness of a specific content could be used in a way or is not surely the correct one. So we cannot use it to verify or to be sure that it really uncovers fakeness here. Maybe it is fake, it is itself fake. So it is difficult to judge from the first view that a specific piece of information is fake or not. This is why we need to develop critical thinking, as it provides a layer of security to people. So we need to let people question, is this video correct? Is this video fake news or not? And the same goes to posts and so forth, and to encourage people to deal with any piece of material from this perspective. And this is the first attempt to try to fight fake news rather than start dealing with the information from a very good faith. Another question. I would like to thank the organizers. I would like to thank the researchers taking part in this session. My question is to Dr. Abdelrahman. In your presentation, you mentioned the possibility of having an academic content that tackles the use of media in order to combat fake news in curriculum, specifically in primary schools, without this being limited to press students. So the question is, how can we accompany the young generations under the fast development and progress of platforms? For instance, take ChatGPT. It is a new tool. Even experts do not know how it would be used and to what extent its content is accurate. Is it enough to have workshops that would go in parallel and be updated continuously and included as part of primary school syllabus, and leave the direct or the automatic update to press students? Let me say that the current generation and the upcoming generations are tech savvy. They have the skills and the capabilities of using social media. Whenever you direct them towards a specific field, that they would be able to reach information, and they have a swift access to information, to detail such information and to deal with such material. So this is an answer to part of your question. The second, the more phenomenon is compound, the more it requires to be dealt with at different levels. We know that these social media platforms are very complicated. Facebook do not act in an ideal world. They are for-profit organized entities, and they invest or their investment lies on or is built on our consumption of their services. So these are for-profit entities. So we can limit their profiteering by reducing the number of users, as we individuals would opt out of using these platforms. Now, regarding educational awareness in schools, we need to build awareness on current platforms. Some of these platforms are supported by Facebook or funded by Facebook, because currently Facebook is under popular pressure worldwide and under legal liability. Now, under this pressure, these platforms find themselves taking action in order to avoid legal liability. So this requires us to work on different axes, workshops, official education, since it is the main place to start with, because schooling and enrollment in schools is obligatory, and this is how we can start this endeavor. We are behind the schedule. Maybe we still have room to one more questions. I work at Al Jazeera. My question is to Dr. Abdulrahman. The presentation you gave is valuable. However, to what extent the platforms in your studies affect users in the Arab world? What I mean by that is the following. Most of these platforms or websites, they are being used by journalists in their work, and they select news in a specific angle, in a specific identity, and so forth. So are the topics that are selected of importance to the public? Yes or no? And then when I use Facebook or Twitter, if during my navigation or the time I spend, I do not get an information to tell me whether or not a news is positive or not, if it doesn't pop out or pop up on my page. For instance, take someone in rural parts of Egypt. How would they be able to know whether or not a certain material is fake or not? In this case, we could move or work by first reporting certain content to be verified, and second, this is done based on certain literatures in verification and fact-finding, which is that any information that is being or becoming popular and highly circulated, here the verification process would work. However, when such applications reach a certain popularity and spread, we would see that sometimes they start taking actions, and therefore whenever these or it is up to the users to report fake news or to request the verifications, because in this case these platforms would be compelled to verify the veracity of such content. So these platforms need to try to gain some credibility by being by verifying news and content.
Many are the questions. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. We ran 40 minutes over time. There will be a fourth session at 2, and it will discuss further this very important topic. Everything related to social media networks and ideological polarization. Held by Al Jazeera Center for Studies and Qatar University Media Department. Thank you to the honorable speakers, Dr. Victor Picard, Dr. Imad bin Labedi, Dr. Hisham al-Makki, and Dr. Abdurrahman al-Shami. Thank you for being with us. We also thank everyone who has followed on this session on Al Jazeera Mubashir and all the different media platforms. Thank you. We will have the lunch break.
Communications Department at Qatar University. On the first and second